Elena Hartman had never imagined that death would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon, without warning, without mercy, and without goodbye. David collapsed in the parking lot of the hardware store where he'd gone to buy paint for the guest bedroom. A massive heart attack at 47. The paramedics said he was likely gone before he hit the asphalt. She received the call while folding laundry in their small suburban home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The phone pressed between her shoulder and ear, her hand still clutching one of his work shirts. The funeral passed in a fog of casseroles and condolences. Neighbors she barely knew filled their living room with platitudes about God's plan and being in a better place. Elena nodded, shook hands, accepted embraces from people whose names she couldn't remember. She wore a simple black dress she'd bought at a department store the day before because she owned nothing appropriate for burying her husband. 12 years of marriage, and she'd never once considered what she would wear to his funeral. In the weeks that followed, Elena moved through the house like a ghost. She slept on the couch because the bedroom felt too large, too empty, too filled with the absence of his breathing beside her. She stopped answering the phone. She ate crackers standing at the kitchen counter at odd hours. The world outside continued its relentless turning, while hers had simply stopped. It was on a gray Wednesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after David's death, that Elena finally forced herself to face the practical realities of widowhood. The bills were piling up. The insurance company needed documents. The bank required death certificates. She stood in David's small home office, a converted spare bedroom that smelled faintly of his cologne and old paper, and began the grim task of sorting through his life. David had always handled their finances. He was meticulous, he'd told her, and she'd been grateful not to worry about it. She worked part-time at the public library, shelving books and helping patrons find romance novels and mystery thrillers. He managed a warehouse for a distribution company. They lived modestly but comfortably, or so she'd believed. The filing cabinet was organized with the precision she'd expected. Folders labeled in his neat handwriting: utilities, insurance, taxes, medical. She pulled each one methodically, making stacks on the desk. And then, pushed toward the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old warranties for appliances they no longer owned, she found an unmarked manila envelope. It was thick, sealed, and when she lifted it, something inside shifted with an unsettling weight. Elena's hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a document, professionally printed on heavy legal paper. Last will and testament of David Michael Hartman. Her breath caught. They'd never discussed a will. She'd assumed they'd get around to it eventually, the way young couples always assume they have more time than they do. She sat down heavily in his desk chair and began to read. The words blurred and sharpened, as her brain struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. David's estate, everything he owned, was to be divided as follows. The house would be sold, his savings accounts, his retirement fund, his life insurance policy. All of it, every single asset, was left to someone named Claire Elizabeth Morrison. Not Elena, not his wife of 12 years. Claire Elizabeth Morrison. Elena read the name 3 times, 4 times, as if repetition might change it into something that made sense. She'd never heard this name before. Not once in 12 years had David mentioned anyone named Claire. She flipped through the pages with growing panic, searching for her own name, for some explanation, for anything that would make this cruel joke reveal itself as a mistake. At the bottom of the envelope, beneath the will, were letters. Not many, perhaps a dozen, but each one written in David's careful handwriting on plain white stationery. They were addressed to Claire. My dearest Claire, my love, my heart. The dates spanned 9 years. 9 years of letters expressing devotion, longing, promises of a future together. In one, dated just 6 months before his death, he wrote, "You are my true home, the only place I've ever truly belonged." Elena sat in the dark office as the afternoon light faded into evening. She didn't turn on the lamp. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, holding the papers in her lap, while the house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. At some point, she walked into the kitchen and sat on the floor with her back against the refrigerator. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The numbers glowed green in the darkness. 2:37 in the morning. And Elena Hartman realized that the woman she'd been, the life she'd believed in, had never actually existed at all. Elena didn't sleep that night. She sat on the cold kitchen floor until dawn crept through the windows, painting everything in shades of gray. Her mind moved in circles, trying to reconstruct 12 years of marriage through this new, terrible lens. Every memory felt suspect now. Every moment potentially a lie. The business trips he'd taken twice a month. Working late on Thursdays. The weekend he'd said he needed to help a colleague move. Had he been with Claire all those times? Had he kissed this woman? Held her? Promised her things while Elena waited at home, believing in a partnership that existed only in her own imagination? She forced herself to read the letters again, slowly this time, looking for clues she might have missed. They were tender, intimate, filled with details of a relationship that was clearly long-term and serious. Claire knew things about David that Elena had never known. His fear of growing old, his regret about never finishing college, his dream of someday owning a small cabin in the mountains. These weren't casual confessions shared in passing. These were the deep revelations of a man in love. In one letter, he wrote about their anniversary dinner, the 9th year they'd been together. Elena did the math with shaking hands. 9 years ago, she and David had been married for 3 years. She remembered that period well. They'd been trying to have a baby, month after month of hope and disappointment, of temperature charts and scheduled intimacy that felt more clinical than romantic. She'd blamed herself when nothing happened. David had told her it didn't matter, that they had time, that they had each other. And all the while, he'd been celebrating anniversaries with someone else. The will itself was dated 2 years prior and had been notarized by a legal firm in Harrisburg, an hour's drive from their home. It was legitimate, official, binding. Elena had no legal training, but even she could see that it had been prepared carefully, methodically. This wasn't a moment of weakness or confusion. David had driven to another city, sat in a lawyer's office, and systematically erased her from his future. As morning light filled the kitchen, Elena finally stood. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long in one position. She walked through the house, seeing it differently now. The guest bedroom he'd been so eager to repaint. Had he planned to bring Claire here eventually? The expensive coffee maker he'd bought last Christmas, far nicer than anything they normally purchased. Had he told Claire about it? Shared morning coffee with her somewhere else while Elena drank cheap instant at home? She found herself in their bedroom, staring at the bed they'd shared. How many nights had he lain beside her, thinking of another woman? How many times had he said, "I love you," while wishing he was somewhere else? The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Elena had believed, with the kind of fundamental certainty that structures a life, that she was loved. Not perfectly, perhaps, not passionately, but solidly and truly. She'd built everything on that foundation, and now she understood she'd been building on sand. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. It was now Friday morning. Elena moved through the day in a trance. She showered because it seemed like something a person should do. She made toast and ate 3 bites before throwing the rest away. The phone rang 7 times. She didn't answer. Martha Voss, David's aunt, left a voicemail asking if Elena needed help with anything before tomorrow. Elena listened to it twice, then deleted it. How could she possibly stand in a church and accept sympathy for losing a man who had never truly been hers? But she went anyway, because what else could she do? She drove to the funeral home in the same black dress, her hair pulled back simply, her face bare of makeup. The viewing was scheduled for 2 hours before the service. Elena arrived exactly on time, walking through the heavy wooden doors into the carpeted silence of grief made public. The casket was open. David looked artificial in death, too still, too composed, like a wax figure of himself. Someone had combed his hair differently than he usually wore it. Elena stood there, staring at this stranger in a suit, and felt absolutely nothing. The man in that casket had betrayed her so completely that even death couldn't resurrect her love for him. People began to arrive. Colleagues from his work, a few cousins she rarely saw, neighbors from their street. They approached her with solemn faces, squeezed her hands, murmured about tragedy and loss. Elena nodded mechanically, her responses automatic and hollow. And then she saw her. The woman entered quietly, alone, dressed in black from head to toe. She was younger than Elena by perhaps 10 years, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and delicate features that might have been pretty if they weren't twisted with genuine anguish. She walked directly to the casket and stood there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A few people glanced at her curiously, but no one seemed to know who she was. Someone whispered, "Poor thing. She must have worked with him." Another voice, sympathetic, "She's taking it very hard." Elena felt the world tilt. She knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at Claire Elizabeth Morrison, the woman David had truly loved, the woman he had chosen in the secret document that erased Elena's entire existence. Claire stood at the casket for a long time, openly weeping in a way that Elena herself hadn't been able to do. This stranger's grief was raw and real and devastating to witness. Their eyes met across the room for just a moment. Claire's face was blotchy from crying, her expression one of pure devastation. Elena saw her own pain reflected there, multiplied, and made worse by the realization that neither of them had known the truth. They were both casualties of David's carefully constructed double life. But Elena couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch as this woman mourned the man they'd both loved and both been betrayed by. Elena turned and walked out of the funeral home without a word to anyone. She left behind the mourners, the flowers, the casket, all of it. She got into her car and drove home in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Once inside the house, she locked the door, drew all the curtains, and sat in the darkness of her living room for 3 days straight, neither eating nor sleeping, just existing in the suffocating weight of a truth she couldn't escape. On the 4th day, Elena emerged from her self-imposed isolation because her body simply demanded it. The hunger had become impossible to ignore, a physical ache that cut through even the numbness. She drove to the grocery store at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, choosing a time when she hoped to avoid anyone she knew. She moved through the aisles mechanically, placing items in her cart without really seeing them. Bread, milk, bananas that were already too ripe. At the checkout, the cashier, a young woman with pink streaks in her hair, smiled brightly and asked how her day was going. Elena stared at her for a long moment, unable to formulate a response to such an absurdly normal question, before finally whispering that it was fine. The funeral service had happened without her. She'd learned this from another voicemail from Martha, this one tinged with worry and confusion about Elena's absence. People had been concerned, Martha said. They'd thought perhaps Elena was too overcome with grief to attend. Someone had suggested she might have been hospitalized. Martha's voice carried an edge of reproach beneath the concern, a subtle suggestion that Elena had failed to perform grief appropriately, had abandoned her duties as the grieving widow. Elena deleted that message too. She couldn't explain to Martha or anyone else that she hadn't been David's widow in any meaningful sense. She'd been his placeholder, his cover story, his convenient fiction. The real mourner had been there, weeping genuine tears over a casket while Elena had fled like a ghost fading at dawn. But she couldn't hide forever. The practicalities of death demanded attention regardless of betrayal. The insurance company had called twice. The mortgage was due. David's employer had sent paperwork that needed to be signed. And there was the matter of the will, that devastating document that had turned her entire life into a question mark. Elena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and searched for Claire Elizabeth Morrison. It took less than 3 minutes to find her. She lived in Carlisle, about 40 minutes away. She worked as a dental hygienist at a family practice downtown. Her Facebook profile was semi-public, and Elena scrolled through it with a sick fascination, studying photographs of a life she'd known nothing about. Claire at a restaurant, laughing over wine. Claire at the beach, her face tilted toward the sun. Claire in what appeared to be a living room that Elena didn't recognize, wearing an oversized sweater and holding a mug decorated with hearts. There were no photos of David. Claire had been careful about that, or perhaps he'd insisted on it. But there were gaps in her timeline that corresponded perfectly with his supposed business trips. A post from 2 years ago. Best weekend getaway ever, dated the same weekend David had told Elena he was attending a warehouse management conference in Pittsburgh. Another post, more recent. Sometimes the simplest moments are the most perfect, accompanied by a photo of 2 coffee cups on a wooden table. One mug Elena recognized. It belonged to David. She'd given it to him for his birthday 3 years ago. Elena closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. The urge to confront Claire was overwhelming, a physical need to make this woman see her, acknowledge her, explain how she could have participated in destroying someone else's marriage. But beneath that anger was something else something that felt uncomfortably like kinship. Claire had been at that funeral. Claire had wept. Claire had believed, just as Elena had, that David loved her. They were both victims of the same man's capacity for deception. The decision to seek legal counsel came not from a desire for justice, but from simple survival. Elena needed to understand what the will meant for her immediate future. Could she stay in the house? Did she have any claim to David's accounts? She found Martha Voss online, a family law attorney with an office in downtown Millbrook. The name was coincidental, or perhaps not. In a town this small, everyone seemed to be connected to everyone else in unexpected ways. Martha's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street. Elena climbed the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with an anxiety that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The waiting room was small and impersonal, decorated with generic landscape prints and outdated magazines. She sat on an uncomfortable chair and waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, until a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes opened the inner office door and called her name. Martha Voss listened without interrupting, as Elena explained everything. The discovery of the will, the letters, Claire Morrison, the 9 years of betrayal she'd been completely unaware of. Elena's voice remained steady throughout, a monotone recitation of facts that felt like they'd happened to someone else. Martha took notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral and professional. When Elena finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Well," Martha said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone of someone who'd heard every variation of human disaster and wasn't easily shocked. "This is certainly a situation." She picked up the copy of the will that Elena had brought and studied it carefully, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she read. After several long minutes, she set it down and looked directly at Elena with eyes that had gone cold. "Technically, he had the legal right to dispose of his property as he wished," Martha said. "Pennsylvania law doesn't require a spouse to inherit, but there are always angles, always ways to fight. Was there any indication he was under duress? On medication that might have affected his judgment? Any signs of cognitive decline?" Elena shook her head to each question, feeling hope drain away with each negative response. Martha tapped her pen against the desk, thinking. "We'll contest it," she said finally, with a decisiveness that left no room for argument. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. This Morrison woman will fight back, and she'll hire lawyers with whatever resources she has. You need to be prepared for that. But I don't believe in letting betrayal be rewarded, Mrs. Hartman. We're going to make this very, very difficult for her." The battle began with paperwork, mountains of it, each form another confirmation that Elena's life had become something measured in legal terminology and filing deadlines. Martha moved with efficient aggression, filing challenges to the will's validity, demanding financial records, requesting depositions. Claire Morrison responded through her own attorney, a man named Richard Kemp, who worked for a firm in Harrisburg that specialized in estate litigation. His letters arrived on expensive letterhead, each one politely worded but unmistakably hostile beneath the professional veneer. Elena sold her wedding ring first. She'd stopped wearing it the day she found the will, and it sat in her jewelry box like an accusation. The jeweler offered her a fraction of what David had supposedly paid for it, but she took the money without negotiating. She needed it for Martha's retainer, for the endless fees that accumulated with each motion filed and each hearing scheduled. The ring had never meant what she thought it did anyway. Selling it felt like a small act of reclamation. Next went the furniture from the guest bedroom, the one David had wanted to repaint. A young couple bought the bed frame and dresser for their first apartment, excited and in love and completely oblivious to the history embedded in those objects. Elena watched them load the furniture into their truck and felt ancient, as if she'd aged decades in the span of weeks. She remembered being that naive once, believing that love was simple and promises were kept. The legal process moved with glacial slowness. Weeks turned into months. Summer arrived and then faded into fall. Elena's savings dwindled. She picked up extra shifts at the library, working evenings and weekends, reshelving books with mechanical efficiency, while her mind ran in circles through the details of her case. Martha had discovered that David's life insurance policy, worth $200,000, named Claire as the sole beneficiary. He'd changed it 3 years ago, removing Elena without ever telling her. That money, combined with his retirement accounts and the equity in the house, meant Claire stood to inherit over $400,000. Elena would be left with nothing but debt and the clothes in her closet. The depositions were worse than Elena had imagined. She sat in a conference room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sallow and sick, and answered questions from Richard Kemp about her marriage. Had she and David been happy? Had they discussed finances? Had she noticed any changes in his behavior? The questions felt designed to paint her as either willfully blind or negligently unaware, and perhaps both were true. She'd lived with a stranger for 12 years and never realized it. What did that say about her? Claire's deposition was scheduled 2 weeks after Elena's. Martha showed her the transcript afterward, and Elena read it alone in her car, unable to bear the thought of anyone watching her reaction. Claire claimed she'd met David at a warehouse industry conference 9 years ago. They'd connected immediately, she said. He'd told her his marriage was loveless, that he'd been planning to leave for years, but felt trapped by financial obligations and fear of hurting Elena. He'd promised Claire they would be together eventually, that he was just waiting for the right time. She'd believed him. She'd built her life around those promises. Elena read those words and felt something crack inside her chest. Claire had been lied to as well, fed a version of their marriage that bore no resemblance to reality. Elena remembered 9 years ago clearly. She and David had taken a weekend trip to the Poconos for their anniversary. They'd hiked and made love and talked about maybe adopting if they couldn't conceive naturally. He'd held her hand and told her she was his best friend, his partner, his home, and apparently, days later or perhaps even simultaneously, he'd been telling Claire that his marriage was dead and Elena was an obligation he resented. The holidays arrived like an assault. Elena worked through Thanksgiving, volunteering to take the shift at the library so her coworkers could be with their families. She ate a sandwich at her desk and told herself it was fine, that she preferred being alone anyway. Christmas was harder. The house felt cavernous and cold despite the heat running constantly. She didn't put up decorations. She didn't buy gifts. She simply endured the days until they passed, and the calendar turned to a new year that promised nothing but more waiting, more legal fees, more hollow victories that wouldn't change the fundamental truth. David had never loved her, and no judge's ruling could give her back the years she'd wasted believing otherwise. Martha called in mid-January with an update. They'd found irregularities in how the will had been executed. The witnesses had been employees at the law firm, which was legal, but potentially problematic. More importantly, David had been on prescription medication for high blood pressure and anxiety in the months before the will was drafted. Medical records showed increasing dosages. It wasn't much, Martha admitted, but it was something. They could argue diminished capacity, question whether he'd been in a proper state of mind to make such significant decisions. Elena listened to this with a detachment that would have alarmed her if she'd had the energy to care. What did it matter if they won? Money wouldn't give her back her dignity. It wouldn't erase the knowledge that she'd been so thoroughly deceived. But she agreed to continue fighting because stopping felt like surrender, and she'd already surrendered too much. She'd given David 12 years. She wouldn't give Claire Morrison her future too. The courthouse in downtown Millbrook was a limestone building that had stood since 1892, its steps worn smooth by generations of people seeking justice or fleeing from it. Elena had come to know those steps intimately over the months of hearings and continuances, the way you learn the geography of any place where suffering becomes routine. It was late March when the rain started, a cold spring downpour that turned the afternoon gray and sent people hurrying under awnings and into doorways. Elena's hearing had been postponed again, some technicality about document authentication that Martha had explained, but that Elena had stopped trying to fully understand. The legal system moved in its own incomprehensible rhythm, and she'd learned that fighting that rhythm only exhausted her further. She'd driven 40 minutes to be told to come back in 2 weeks. The wasted time felt like a metaphor for her entire life lately. She should have driven straight home, but the thought of her empty house filled her with a weariness so profound it felt physical. Instead, she walked through the rain without an umbrella, letting the water soak through her coat and into her hair, finding a strange comfort in the cold discomfort of it. People gave her odd looks as they rushed past with their umbrellas, and newspapers held over their heads. But Elena didn't care. She was beyond caring what strangers thought. The cafe was called the Corner Post, a narrow establishment wedged between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. Elena had passed it dozens of times but never gone inside. Now, soaked and shivering, she pushed through the door more for shelter than any real desire for coffee. The interior was warm and smelled of espresso and wet wood. Only a handful of tables were occupied. She ordered coffee from a barista who looked barely out of high school, paid with crumpled bills from her coat pocket, and sat at a table near the back, as far from other people as possible. The coffee was terrible, bitter and burnt, but she wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug and let the heat seep into her frozen fingers. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the window in sheets. Elena stared at nothing, her mind a blank space she'd learned to cultivate to avoid the constant loop of pain and anger that threatened to consume her whenever she thought too much. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear fell into her coffee, creating ripples across the dark surface. Then another. She pressed her napkin to her eyes, mortified at this public display of weakness, but unable to stop the tears once they'd started. The weight of everything, the months of fighting and losing and discovering new depths of betrayal, crashed over her all at once. She sat there in a cheap cafe, crying quietly into terrible coffee, while rain pounded against the windows, and the world moved on without her. "Excuse me," a voice said gently. "I don't mean to intrude, but you look like you might need a friend." Elena looked up to find an elderly man standing beside her table. He was tall and thin, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a wool cardigan that had seen better days and held a cup of tea in both hands. His expression was concerned but not pitying, which was perhaps why Elena didn't immediately tell him to leave her alone. "I'm fine," she said automatically, even though her tear-streaked face made the lie obvious. "Of course," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "But I've been sitting alone at that table by the window for the better part of an hour, and I've come to realize that being fine and being alone aren't always the same thing. Sometimes being fine requires another human being to exist in the same space, even if no words are exchanged." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I'm Vincent Caldwell. I taught literature for 40 years before I retired, which means I'm excellent at talking and even better at listening. You're welcome to tell me I'm a meddling old man and send me away, but if you'd like company, even silent company, I'm offering it freely with no expectations attached." Elena studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine kindness or something more suspicious, but there was something in his demeanor, a gentle patience, that suggested he truly meant what he said. She was so tired of being alone with her thoughts, so exhausted by the weight of carrying everything by herself. Before she could talk herself out of it, she gestured to the empty chair across from her. Vincent sat down slowly, the way older people do when their joints protest movement. He didn't speak immediately, didn't ask what was wrong or offer empty platitudes. He simply sat there, sipping his tea, occasionally glancing out the window at the rain. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable, lacking the awkward tension Elena usually felt around strangers. "My husband died 7 months ago," Elena heard herself say, the words emerging without conscious decision. "And I've spent every day since then discovering that I never really knew him at all." Vincent nodded slowly, as if this confession made perfect sense. "Grief is complicated," he said, "but betrayal discovered through grief is something else entirely. It's like mourning a person who never existed, while simultaneously being angry at the person who did. There's no clean way through that particular darkness." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly wound coil of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. This stranger had articulated something she'd been unable to express even to herself. "How did you know?" she asked. "My wife passed away 6 years ago," Vincent said quietly. "Cancer. I nursed her through 2 years of treatment, held her hand through the worst of it, and thought we'd said everything that needed saying. Then, cleaning out her things afterward, I found letters. Not infidelity, nothing like that, but a whole interior life she'd never shared with me, dreams she'd abandoned to marry me, regrets about choices made. It didn't change the fact that she loved me, but it made me realize I'd loved my idea of her rather than the complete person she actually was. That's a hard truth to swallow." They talked for 2 hours, until the rain stopped and the late afternoon light turned golden. Vincent told her about his wife Margaret, about teaching Dickens to disinterested teenagers, about learning to live alone in a house that still smelled like her perfume. Elena told him about David, about Claire Morrison, about the legal battle that was consuming what remained of her life. She told him things she'd never said aloud to anyone, and he listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention. When they finally left the cafe, Vincent wrote his phone number on a napkin and handed it to her. "I come here every Tuesday and Thursday around 2, he said. "If you'd like company again, I'll be here. No obligation, no expectations. Just an old man who's learned that sharing the burden makes it lighter, even if only fractionally." Elena took the napkin and tucked it into her pocket. She drove home through streets washed clean by rain, and for the first time in months, she didn't dread walking through her front door quite as much. Elena told herself she wouldn't go back to the cafe. The encounter with Vincent had been a moment of weakness, a temporary lapse in the protective walls she'd built around herself. She didn't need friends. She didn't need companionship. She needed to focus on the legal battle, on surviving each day, on not letting the betrayal consume her entirely. But when Tuesday arrived, she found herself parking near the courthouse, even though she had no hearing scheduled, walking the 2 blocks to the corner post. Pushing through the door at exactly 2:15, Vincent was there, sitting at the same table by the window, reading a paperback book with a worn cover. He looked up when she entered, and his face broke into a warm smile that reached his eyes. He didn't comment on her arrival, or make a show of being pleased she'd come. He simply gestured to the empty chair and said, "I was hoping you'd show up. I brought something for you." He slid the book across the table. It was a collection of Mary Oliver poems, the pages dog-eared and annotated in neat pencil marks. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said. Oliver understood grief and transformation better than most. "There's a particular poem on page 47 that helped me considerably after Margaret died, but take your time with it. Poetry isn't meant to be rushed." Elena picked up the book carefully, surprised by the intimacy of the gesture. This wasn't something impersonal purchased for the occasion. This was Vincent's own book, filled with his thoughts and reactions, a piece of his interior life he was sharing with a near stranger. She opened to page 47 and read the poem he'd mentioned, about wild geese and belonging and letting the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Something in her throat tightened. They fell into a routine without ever explicitly agreeing to one. Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:00, Elena would drive to Millbrook and meet Vincent at the cafe. Sometimes they talked for hours, conversations ranging from profound to mundane. He told her about his favorite students, the ones who'd actually read the assignments and asked questions that showed they were thinking. She told him about her work at the library, about the regular patrons who came in every week for the new mystery releases or the romance novels they'd read in a single sitting. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, reading or watching people pass by the window, content to exist in proximity without the pressure of constant conversation. Elena began to understand that this was what healthy companionship looked like, something David had never offered her. There was no performance required, no version of herself she needed to present. Vincent seemed to appreciate her exactly as she was, broken edges and all. He brought her books regularly, a steady supply of poetry and novels he thought she'd enjoy. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because magical realism helps us see that the impossible happens every day. Toni Morrison, because she writes about survival with a beauty that doesn't diminish the pain. Wendell Berry, because he understands that healing comes from paying attention to small, ordinary things. Elena read them all, sometimes in the cafe, sometimes late at night in her empty house when sleep wouldn't come. In mid-April, Vincent suggested they walk instead of sitting inside. "Spring is trying to happen," he said, "and we should encourage it by bearing witness." They walked through Riverside Park, a small green space along Millbrook Creek where ducks gathered and early flowers were beginning to emerge. Vincent moved slowly but steadily, occasionally pausing to point out a particular tree or bird. He told her the Latin names for things, remnants of a college botany class he'd taken 50 years ago, and Elena found herself genuinely interested in these small facts. "You're different than you were a month ago," Vincent observed as they sat on a bench overlooking the creek. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. Elena considered this. She didn't feel different, not exactly. The pain was still there, the anger and betrayal still fresh wounds, but something had shifted slightly, like a door opening just a crack in a dark room. I can breathe a little easier, she said finally. The weight hasn't lifted, but I'm getting stronger at carrying it. That's all we can ask for, Vincent replied. Grief and betrayal don't disappear. We just grow larger around them until they occupy a smaller percentage of who we are. He paused, watching a duck navigate the slow-moving water. Margaret and I were married for 42 years. After she died, people kept telling me I'd move on, find someone new, start over. As if love was replaceable. As if 4 decades could be neatly filed away and forgotten. But that's not how it works. She's still with me, the real her, and the one I thought I knew. I've just learned to carry both versions without letting them destroy me. Elena felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were different tears than the ones she'd cried before. These weren't tears of devastation, but of recognition, of being understood in a way she desperately needed. Thank you, she whispered, and Vincent simply nodded, understanding that gratitude encompassed far more than just this moment. As spring deepened into early summer, Elena began to notice things she'd stopped seeing during the dark months of winter. The way morning light hit her kitchen window, the particular shade of green the trees turned in May, the taste of strawberries from the farmer's market. Small things, ordinary things, but they felt like evidence that she was still capable of experiencing beauty despite everything. And increasingly, she associated these small moments of grace with Vincent's presence in her life, with the way he'd shown her that companionship didn't have to be complicated or painful, that sometimes it could just be 2 people sharing space and time without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. She caught herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an anticipation that felt almost guilty, as if wanting something good was a betrayal of the suffering she was supposed to be enduring. But Vincent had told her once that healing wasn't linear, that it involved false starts and setbacks and unexpected moments of joy that felt wrong until you learned to accept them. So Elena let herself anticipate their meetings. She let herself smile at his terrible jokes about literary theory. She let herself feel something other than anger and grief, even if only for a few hours twice a week. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elena Hartman began to remember who she'd been before David, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. She began to remember that she was a person worthy of kindness, of friendship, of attention freely given without expectation of return. It was a fragile realization, easily shattered, but it was there, and it was growing. It was a Thursday in early June when Vincent didn't show up at the cafe. Elena arrived at their usual time, ordered her coffee from the barista who now knew her by name, and sat at their regular table by the window. 2 o'clock came and went, then 2:30. She told herself he'd simply forgotten, or perhaps had another obligation, though in the 3 months they'd been meeting, Vincent had never once failed to appear. He was unfailingly punctual, often arriving before her with his tea already steaming on the table. By 3 o'clock, Elena felt an unfamiliar anxiety settling in her chest. It surprised her, this depth of concern for someone she'd known such a short time. But Vincent had become a fixture in her life, a steady presence she'd come to rely on in ways she was only now beginning to understand. She left the cafe and walked to her car, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that he was fine, that she'd simply see him next Tuesday. But the worry lingered through the weekend. On Monday morning, she was shelving books in the library's fiction section when she overheard 2 older women talking near the new releases display. One of them mentioned Vincent Caldwell by name, saying something about him being in the hospital, nothing serious but a precaution after a fall. Elena's hands froze on the spine of the book she'd been about to slide into place. She approached the women with her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I couldn't help overhearing. Vincent Caldwell, do you know which hospital?" The women looked at her with mild surprise. Then the taller one, wearing a purple cardigan, told her he was at Millbrook General, that her daughter worked in admissions and had mentioned seeing his name on the patient list that morning. Elena left work early, claiming a sudden headache that wasn't entirely untrue. The hospital was a 10-minute drive from the library, a modern building that still somehow managed to smell like every hospital she'd ever been in. Antiseptic and cafeteria food, and something underneath that might have been fear. The woman at the information desk found Vincent's room number after checking her computer, and Elena took the elevator to the 3rd floor with her stomach in knots. She found him in room 307, sitting up in bed and looking irritated rather than ill. His left wrist was wrapped in a bandage, and there was a small bruise on his temple, but otherwise he seemed fine. His face brightened considerably when he saw her in the doorway. "Elena?" he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I was hoping you wouldn't hear about this. I'm perfectly fine, just a stupid accident. I tripped over a box in my garage and caught myself badly. The paramedics insisted on bringing me in. Complete overreaction." He gestured at the monitors beeping beside his bed with obvious disdain. "They're keeping me overnight for observation because apparently being old means every minor incident requires maximum medical intervention." Elena pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, relief washing over her in waves. "You scared me," she admitted. "When you didn't show up Thursday, I thought—" She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "I'm sorry," Vincent said softly. "I should have found a way to let you know. I didn't realize you'd worry." There was something in his expression, a warmth mixed with surprise, as if her concern touched him in a way he hadn't expected. They talked for over an hour, until a nurse came in to check Vincent's vitals and suggested he should rest. Elena stood to leave, but Vincent caught her hand gently. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It means more than you might realize." Elena drove home with her mind churning. When she got back to her house, she opened her laptop and did something she'd been resisting for months. She searched for Vincent Caldwell. Really searched this time. Not just a casual glance, but a thorough investigation. What she found made her sit back in her chair, stunned. Vincent Caldwell wasn't just a retired literature professor living modestly in Millbrook. He was Vincent Robert Caldwell, former chair of the English department at Haverford College, published author of 3 books on Victorian literature, and according to several articles she found, the heir to a considerable fortune from his family's commercial real estate investments throughout Pennsylvania. His father had built a small empire of shopping centers and office buildings in the 70s and 80s, and when he'd died 15 years ago, Vincent and his sister had inherited everything. There were photos of him at university functions, at literary events, always dressed impeccably, and looking distinguished in ways that his casual cardigan and worn paperbacks had disguised. One article from a Philadelphia magazine mentioned that he'd donated over $2 million to establish a scholarship fund in his late wife's name. Another piece discussed his modest lifestyle despite his wealth, noting that he lived in a small house in Millbrook and drove a 15-year-old sedan. Elena's mind raced backward through every conversation they'd had. Vincent had never once mentioned money. He'd never displayed any sign of wealth. He lived simply, met her in a cheap cafe, wore ordinary clothes. Why had he hidden this? And more troubling, how much did he know about her situation? She thought of Martha Voss, her attorney. Martha Voss and Vincent Caldwell. The surnames were the same. She opened a new search window with trembling fingers and found the connection within minutes. Martha's website listed her full name, Martha Voss Caldwell. She'd kept her married name after a divorce years ago, but her maiden name was listed in her bio, and her uncle, whom she'd been named after with the middle name Vincent, was mentioned in a small footnote about her family's commitment to education and law. Martha was Vincent's niece. Elena sat in her kitchen as evening darkened into night, staring at the laptop screen. Vincent had known who she was from the very beginning. That first day at the cafe, when he'd approached her table with such careful kindness, he'd already known about David's betrayal, about the will, about Claire Morrison, and the legal battle consuming her life. Martha must have told him, must have mentioned her difficult case about a widow discovering her husband's double life. And Vincent had sought her out deliberately. The realization should have made her angry. It should have felt like another betrayal, another person deceiving her for reasons she couldn't understand. But instead, Elena felt something more complicated, a confusion of emotions she couldn't untangle. Vincent had never used his knowledge to manipulate her. He'd never offered legal advice or tried to influence her case. He'd simply been present, offering friendship and books and companionship with no apparent agenda. But he'd lied by omission, had let her believe their meeting was chance when it had been anything but. He'd hidden his wealth, his connection to her attorney, his entire real life, while encouraging her to share every painful detail of hers. Elena closed the laptop and sat in darkness, feeling the familiar weight of betrayal settling over her shoulders like a cold, heavy blanket. Just when she'd begun to trust again, to believe that human connection could be simple and honest, she'd discovered another layer of deception. She didn't return to the cafe the following Tuesday. She didn't answer when Vincent called her cell phone twice that afternoon. his number showing up on her screen like an accusation. She went to work, came home, and tried to convince herself that she was better off alone anyway, that needing people only led to disappointment and pain. But the house felt emptier than before, and the books Vincent had given her sat on her shelf, like evidence of something she couldn't quite name, something that might have been real, even if the circumstances around it had been orchestrated. Martha called on a Wednesday morning in mid-June with news that made Elena's carefully constructed emotional walls crack even further. Her voice carried an energy Elena hadn't heard before, a barely contained excitement that made her sit up straighter at her desk in the library's back office. "We've got something," Martha said without preamble. "Something significant. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I want to walk you through this in person." Elena arrived at 2:30, taking the familiar stairs to Martha's second-floor office with a mix of hope and exhaustion. Hope had become a dangerous thing over the past 11 months, something that inevitably led to disappointment, but she couldn't help the flutter in her chest as she sat across from Martha, who had papers spread across her desk like a general planning a battle strategy. "The will is invalid," Martha said, sliding a document across the desk. "Completely, entirely invalid. We can prove it." Elena stared at the papers without really seeing them, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "How?" she managed to ask. Martha leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from finding the fatal flaw in an opponent's armor. Two issues, actually. First, the witnesses. We've been investigating the law firm that drafted the will, the one in Harrisburg. Turns out one of the witnesses, a paralegal named Dennis Hoffman, wasn't actually present when David signed the document. He was on vacation in Florida. We have receipts, plane tickets, hotel confirmation, the works. He signed as a witness 3 days after the fact, which completely invalidates the entire document under Pennsylvania law. Elena felt dizzy, like the ground beneath her was shifting. And the second issue? David's medical records. You mentioned he was on medication for high blood pressure and anxiety. I subpoenaed his complete medical file from his doctor. In the 6 months before he signed that will, his dosage had been increased 3 times. More importantly, he'd started taking Ambien for insomnia and was mixing it with the anxiety medication. His doctor had noted concerns about cognitive side effects, memory issues, confusion. There are documented appointments where David complained about feeling foggy and making mistakes at work. We have a strong case for arguing he wasn't in a sound mental state to make major legal decisions. Martha pulled out another file, this one thicker. I had a forensic psychiatrist review everything. His expert opinion is that the combination of medications David was taking, at those dosages, would have significantly impaired his judgment and decision-making capacity. It's not a guarantee, but combined with the witness fraud, we have grounds for a complete invalidation of the will. Elena's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs under the desk. What does this mean? Specifically, it means that if the will is invalid, David died intestate, without a legal will. Under Pennsylvania intestate succession law, you, as his legal spouse, inherit everything. The house, his accounts, his retirement fund, the life insurance. All of it. Claire Morrison gets nothing. Martha paused, watching Elena's face carefully. The hearing is scheduled for next Monday. Richard Kemp is going to fight this hard. He'll bring in his own medical experts, try to discredit our witnesses. But Elena, I think we're going to win this. Elena should have felt triumphant. This was what she'd been fighting for. What she'd sold her possessions and worked extra shifts and endured endless legal humiliation to achieve. But instead, she felt hollow, as if winning this battle couldn't possibly fill the void David's betrayal had created. And if we win, she said slowly, what happens to Claire? Martha's expression hardened slightly. She loses. She gets nothing. She was the other woman, Elena. She participated in the destruction of your marriage for 9 years. Why do you care what happens to her? I don't know, Elena admitted. Maybe because she was lied to as well. Maybe because being angry at her hasn't made me feel any better. She looked down at the papers on Martha's desk, at the evidence of David's impaired judgment and fraudulent documentation. He used both of us. He made promises to both of us. She thought he loved her. I thought he loved me. We were both wrong. That's very generous of you, Martha said, her tone suggesting she didn't think generosity was warranted. But this isn't about emotions. It's about what's legally and morally right. You were his wife. You're entitled to his estate. The law is clear on this. The hearing the following Monday was nothing like the countless preliminary appearances Elena had endured over the past months. This time, the courtroom was fuller, the atmosphere charged with the weight of a real decision being made. Claire Morrison sat on the opposite side with Richard Kemp, and for the first time since the funeral, Elena looked directly at her. Claire had lost weight, her face drawn and tired. She looked small and frightened, nothing like the confident woman whose Facebook photos Elena had obsessively studied months ago. Martha presented their case with devastating efficiency. The witness fraud was irrefutable, documented with travel records and time-stamped evidence that made Richard Kemp's objections sound weak and desperate. The medical evidence was more subjective, but equally compelling. The forensic psychiatrist testified for 40 minutes about cognitive impairment and decision-making capacity, using terms that made David sound like a victim of his own brain chemistry rather than a calculating deceiver. Richard Kemp tried to recover, bringing in his own expert who argued that medication side effects were speculative, that plenty of people functioned perfectly well on similar drug combinations. But the witness fraud hung over everything like a dark cloud. You couldn't explain away a paralegal signing a document while sitting on a beach in Tampa. The judge, an older woman named Patricia Hendricks with gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck, listened to everything with an impassive expression. When both sides had finished, she removed her glasses and looked directly at Elena for a long moment that felt like an eternity. "This is a complicated case," Judge Hendricks said finally. "A marriage of 12 years, ended by death, followed by the discovery of a long-term affair and a will that appears to have been executed improperly and possibly under cognitive duress. The legal issues here are actually quite straightforward despite the emotional complexity. The will cannot stand. The witness fraud alone is sufficient grounds for invalidation. Therefore, I am ruling that David Michael Hartman died intestate, and his estate will be distributed according to Pennsylvania intestate succession law, with his surviving spouse, Elena Hartman, as the sole heir." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed too small for the magnitude of what it represented. Elena sat frozen in her chair, while Martha squeezed her arm in victory. Across the courtroom, Claire Morrison put her face in her hands and wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Richard Kemp gathered his papers with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd lost and wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Elena walked out of the courtroom into the June sunshine and felt absolutely nothing. She'd won. She'd inherited everything David had tried to take from her. The house was hers. The money was hers. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But David was still dead. He'd still betrayed her. He'd still never loved her the way she'd believed. And no judge's ruling could change those fundamental truths. Martha walked her to her car, still buzzing with professional satisfaction. "I'll start the paperwork to transfer everything into your name. It'll take a few weeks, but Elena, you did it. You won." Elena nodded mechanically and drove home to the house that was now legally, unquestionably hers. She walked through rooms that felt like they belonged to a stranger, sat on furniture she'd paid to keep, and stared at walls she could now paint any color she wanted. The victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She'd spent 11 months fighting for this moment, and now that it was here, she couldn't remember why it had mattered so much. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the court ruling. Elena recognized the handwriting immediately. That careful script she'd seen in the margins of borrowed books and on napkins where Vincent had jotted down titles he thought she'd enjoy. Her name was written on the front in blue ink. Her address spelled out precisely with none of the abbreviations people usually used. The return address was his, a street in Millbrook she'd never visited despite months of friendship. Elena stood in her kitchen holding the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of her wanted to throw it away unread, to maintain the protective anger she'd built around Vincent's deception. But curiosity and something deeper, something that felt uncomfortably like longing, made her slide her finger under the sealed flap and pull out the pages inside. There were 3 sheets, front and back, filled with Vincent's measured handwriting. The letter began without preamble, as if they were continuing a conversation that had been interrupted rather than starting fresh after weeks of silence. "Dear Elena," he wrote, I imagine by now you've discovered who I am beyond the version of myself I presented to you. I imagine Martha mentioned our relationship, or perhaps you found it on your own, through the kind of research that this digital age makes both necessary and invasive. Either way, you know that our first meeting was not the accident I allowed you to believe it was, and for that deception, I owe you both an explanation and an apology. Elena sat down at the kitchen table, her coffee forgotten, and continued reading. Vincent's words were characteristically thoughtful, each sentence constructed with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime teaching others to value language. Martha told me about your case in late February. The letter continued. She was frustrated by the cruelty of it, by the particular pain of your situation. Over dinner one evening, after perhaps too much wine, she confessed that she worried about you beyond the professional boundaries she normally maintained. She said you seemed utterly alone, that you came to meetings looking progressively more hollow, that she could see you disappearing into your grief and rage with no one to pull you back. I told her I would check on you, purely as a favor to her, purely to ensure you weren't in danger of harming yourself in your isolation. Elena's hands tightened on the pages, so it had been exactly as she'd suspected. Pity, obligation, family duty, not genuine friendship at all. But Vincent's next words complicated that simple narrative. I went to that cafe expecting to fulfill an obligation. I thought I would sit near you, assess your state of mind, perhaps offer some generic comfort if the opportunity presented itself, and then report back to Martha that you seemed stable if miserable. I expected to spend perhaps 15 minutes in your presence before returning to my ordinary solitude. What I did not expect, what I could never have predicted, was you. The letter described their first conversation from Vincent's perspective, details Elena had forgotten or never fully noticed. The way her hands had trembled when she lifted her coffee cup, the particular quality of her voice when she first spoke, rough with tears but trying for normalcy, the moment when she'd looked directly at him and he'd seen not just pain, but a fierce intelligence that refused to be extinguished by grief. You were drowning, he wrote, but you were also fighting. And I found myself wanting to know more about a woman who could endure such comprehensive betrayal and still show up to face another day. Elena felt tears beginning to form and blinked them back angrily. She didn't want to be moved by this. She didn't want his eloquent explanations to matter. I should have told you the truth after our second or third meeting, Vincent continued. I should have confessed that I knew Martha, that I knew the details of your case, that our meeting had been arranged rather than accidental. But I was afraid that confession would end whatever was developing between us, and I found myself unwilling to lose your company. Selfish, perhaps. Certainly dishonest by omission. But Elena, everything that followed that deception was genuine. Every conversation, every book recommendation, every hour we spent together in that cafe or walking through the park, those were real. My interest in you, my growing affection, my admiration for your strength and resilience, all of it was absolutely real. The letter went on to explain Vincent's life in more detail than he'd ever shared in person. His marriage to Margaret, 42 years that had been genuinely happy despite the regrets she'd hidden. His career teaching literature, the satisfaction and frustration of trying to make 19th century novels relevant to 21st century students. The inheritance that had made him wealthy on paper, but hadn't changed his fundamental values, or the simple way he preferred to live. Money, he wrote, is useful for security and for helping others, but it's a poor substitute for genuine human connection, and I learned after Margaret died that wealth makes authentic friendship difficult. People see the money before they see the person. You didn't know about any of that, and so you saw me clearly, without the distortion that wealth creates. Toward the end of the letter, Vincent's tone shifted to something more vulnerable, less certain. I don't know if you can forgive me for the initial deception. I don't know if we can return to the friendship we were building before you discovered the truth. But I need you to know that meeting you, knowing you, spending time with you these past months has been the first time since Margaret's death that I've felt genuinely alive rather than simply going through the motions of living. You reminded me that even after profound loss, even after every illusion has been stripped away, it's possible to connect with another human being in ways that feel true and necessary. The final paragraph was shorter, almost hesitant. I won't presume to call you or show up at the cafe hoping you'll arrive. The next move, if there is one, has to be yours. But Elena, if you can find it in yourself to give me another chance, to let me be your friend in full honesty this time with no secrets between us. I would consider it a gift I don't deserve, but would cherish immensely. I'm at home most days, or at the cafe on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 o'clock, just in case. Yours with respect and hope, Vincent. Elena set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking minutes that felt suspended somehow, as if time itself was waiting for her to decide something important. She thought about David's letters to Claire, full of promises and passion that had existed alongside a marriage he'd treated as an inconvenient obligation. She thought about all the ways people lied, both explicitly and through silence, creating alternate realities that served their purposes. But Vincent's deception, while real, felt different in scale and intention. He hadn't hidden a double life. He hadn't made promises he never intended to keep. He'd simply failed to mention that he already knew her story before she told it to him. Everything after that, their conversations and silences, the books and walks and gradual rebuilding of her ability to trust, all of that had been genuine, or at least she wanted to believe it had been. Elena picked up the letter and read it again, more slowly this time, weighing each sentence against her memories of their time together. Vincent had never pushed her to make decisions about her case. He'd never offered legal advice or tried to influence her relationship with Martha. He'd simply been present, offering companionship without agenda, listening without judgment. That had value, didn't it? That mattered, even if the circumstances of their meeting had been orchestrated. She didn't know what to do with this information, how to reconcile her anger at being deceived with her genuine need for the friendship Vincent had offered. So she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her kitchen table, next to the stack of books he'd lent her over the months, and tried to figure out whether forgiveness was possible, or if trust, once broken, could ever be fully repaired. It took Elena 2 weeks to decide, 2 weeks of living in the house that was now fully hers, of managing the transfer of accounts and assets from David's name to her own, of existing in the strange liminal space between victory and emptiness. Martha handled most of the paperwork, professional and efficient, never mentioning Vincent or asking why Elena had stopped meeting him at the cafe. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps Vincent had told her about the letter, about Elena's discovery of their connection. The money appeared in Elena's account on a Tuesday morning in early July. She stared at the number on her laptop screen, the sum total of David's life insurance and retirement accounts and savings, and felt nothing resembling joy. It was more money than she'd ever had, enough to live comfortably for years if she was careful, enough to start over somewhere new if she wanted, to leave Millbrook and its memories behind entirely. But she'd learned that running from pain only meant carrying it to new locations. Geography didn't heal betrayal. Time and truth and human connection did that, slowly and incompletely, if they did it at all. She thought about Claire Morrison occasionally, wondered how she was managing in the aftermath of losing everything she'd been promised. Elena had won, but the victory felt hollow, because winning meant someone else had lost. And that person had been just as deceived as she had been. David was the villain in this story, the architect of pain for both women who'd loved him. Hating Claire had become impossible once Elena understood that simple truth. On a Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after receiving Vincent's letter, Elena drove to Millbrook. She didn't plan it consciously, didn't wake up that morning with a decision made, but at 1:45, she found herself parking near the courthouse and walking the familiar 2 blocks to the corner post. Her heart was pounding harder than the short walk warranted, her palms damp with nervous sweat. Vincent was there, sitting at their usual table by the window with a cup of tea and a book. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, though perhaps that was just her perspective colored by knowledge she now possessed. He glanced up when the bell above the door chimed her entrance, and his face transformed. Not a smile exactly, but a softening, a visible relief that made him look younger again. Elena ordered coffee from the same barista who'd been watching their friendship develop for months, then walked to Vincent's table and sat down without asking permission. They looked at each other across the scarred wooden surface, and the silence between them felt heavy with things unsaid. "I got your letter," Elena said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I hoped you would," Vincent replied quietly, "though hoping and knowing are different things. And I've spent 2 weeks uncertain which reality I was living in." Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. "You lied to me. Not directly, maybe, but by omission. which amounts to the same thing. You let me believe our friendship was accidental when it was anything but. Yes, Vincent said simply. He didn't offer excuses or justifications, just acknowledged the truth of her statement. I've had enough of deception, Elena continued, her eyes fixed on his face, watching for any sign of insincerity. I've had enough of people saying one thing and meaning another, of hidden agendas and secret lives. If we're going to be friends, if we're going to continue whatever this is, then I need complete honesty, not partial truth, not careful omission. Everything. Vincent nodded slowly. You deserve that. You've always deserved that, and I failed to provide it. I can't undo that failure, but I can promise you absolute transparency going forward. No more secrets. No more strategic silence. Ask me anything, and I'll answer truthfully, even if the truth is uncomfortable or unflattering. Elena took a sip of her coffee, buying time to organize her thoughts. Why did you really come that first day? Not the version you told Martha, but the real reason. What did you hope to gain? Vincent set down his teacup and leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Honestly, I think I was lonely. Margaret had been gone for 6 years, and I'd convinced myself that I preferred solitude, that I'd had my great love, and anything else would be a pale imitation. But when Martha described someone drowning in betrayal and isolation, I recognized something of myself in that description. I thought perhaps we could help each other. 2 people who'd lost their illusions about love and partnership. I didn't expect to care about you as much as I do. I didn't expect you to become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with obligation or pity. And the money? Elena asked. Why hide that? Why pretend to be just a modest retired professor living simply? Because money changes how people see you, Vincent said. It changes how they interact with you, what they assume about you, what they want from you. I've had friendships that turned out to be investments, people who were interested in my resources rather than my company. Living simply, keeping that part of my life private, lets me see who people are without the distortion of wealth. With you, I could just be Vincent, a man who likes poetry and bad coffee, and conversations that matter. Not Vincent Caldwell, the benefactor or the wealthy widower. Just Vincent. Elena understood that, perhaps more than he realized. She'd spent 12 years being Mrs. David Hartman, a role she'd played without understanding it was a performance. Stripping away all the pretense, all the social definitions and expectations, was both terrifying and necessary. I won the case, she said, changing the subject slightly. The will was invalidated. I inherited everything. I know, Vincent said gently. Martha told me. I'm glad. Not because of the money, but because justice was served. Because you weren't erased the way David tried to erase you. It doesn't feel like justice, Elena admitted. It just feels like winning a game I never wanted to play. Claire Morrison lost everything she'd been promised. She was lied to, just like I was. David destroyed both of us, and the legal system made me the winner by default. But we're both casualties of his deception. Vincent reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. A gesture so gentle it made Elena's throat tighten. That's a very compassionate perspective, he said. Most people in your position would celebrate their victory without considering the complexity. The fact that you can see Claire as another victim rather than just your enemy says something profound about your character. Elena looked down at their joined hands, his age spotted and wrinkled, hers younger but scarred by everything she'd endured. I don't want to be angry anymore, she said quietly. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being defined by what David did to me. But I don't know how to move forward. I don't know who I am without the anger to motivate me. You're Elena Hartman, Vincent said firmly. Not David's widow. Not the woman he betrayed. Just Elena, who loves books and works at a library and is figuring out what comes next. That's enough. That's more than enough. They sat together until the cafe closed at 6, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time. When they finally left, Vincent walked Elena to her car and said, Would you consider having dinner with me? Not at a cafe, but at my home. I'll cook. Nothing fancy. Just a meal shared between friends who are starting over with complete honesty between them. Elena hesitated only briefly before agreeing. This weekend? She said. Saturday evening, if that works. It works perfectly, Vincent replied, his face lighting up with genuine joy that made him look decades younger.